measure, this has been a frustrating and unsettling time for all of us. But in the midst of uncertainty, it can be helpful and even encouraging to explore the real-life examples of others whose lives, work, and imagination and relationships were indelibly changed by the difficult times that they were in, and the way they redeemed those times to leave the world a more thoughtful and grace-filled place. And it's hard to imagine two authors who were close and longtime friends who did more to influence the moral, literary, and spiritual imagination of new generations than C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. So it seemed especially fitting to consider the topic of what C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien have to teach us about resilience and imagination at our own time. And we are so glad to be joined in that venture by the ever-energetic and the ever-enthusiastic Joe Loconte. Joe is a professor of history at King's College in New York and the author of several books, including The Searchers, The Quest for Faith in the Valley of Doubt, The End of Illusions, Religious Leaders Confront Hitler's Gathering Storm, God, Locke, and Liberty, which I seem to see on your shelf just behind you, Joe, and his newest release, A Hobbit, a Wardrobe, and a Great War, which is in the process of being made into a documentary, which we'll show a trailer for which at the very end of today's online conversation. Joe, it is great to have you here.
Cherie, it is just terrific to be with you, and I love the title of this talk, Suffering, Friendship, and Courage, because you've been suffering through your friendship with me over the last couple of decades, and it's given you great courage. So it's terrific to be with you. Thanks so much for having me.
So Joe, for as long as I've known you, which I think has been over 2 decades now, you've been an avid fan and close reader of both Lewis and Tolkien. And in fact, I think when I first read you, you were in the midst of hosting a Lewis and Linguini supper, where you were trying to introduce more people to the works of C.S. Lewis. And I think you continue those suppers. So how did you first discover Lewis and Tolkien, and what caused you to love their works?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Cherie. For C.S. Lewis, it was my undergraduate days at the campus at the University of Illinois, where I would say I really became a Christian, committed my life to Christ, and then just stumbled upon mere Christianity in a bookstore. And then I'm hooked because he's explaining the Christian understanding of life in a way I could grasp. For Tolkien, he came much, much later in life. I was doing my graduate work, my dissertation work on John Locke, by the way, there in London, at the University of London. And after the movies come out, I decided I need to read Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. And so it was John Locke during the day, and it was Tolkien at night in an English pub. It was a great way to spend the evenings.
Now, Joe, you're a historian, and both Lewis and Tolkien were soldiers and were on the front of World War I. It's been over a century since World War I, and so it's often, we tend to forget just what a huge impact the war had on the public imagination and what disillusionment it caused. I was hoping you could just kind of walk us through and unpack some of the context of the time, the way that the war affected the worldviews of people really all over the world, and the impact it had on both Lewis and Tolkien.
Thanks for that question. And there's so many wonderful biographies of both those men out there that I've benefited from. And yet I don't think there's been enough attention to the way in which both of their lives were really framed by war. They both fought in the First World War in the trenches in France, and then they have to live through a Second World War and everything in between. And it's kind of the in-between that is really pretty remarkable and in some ways terrifying, because after the First World War, all the hopes that were placed on this generation and European civilization, and then Europe is engaged in basically a mutual suicide pact in the trenches in France. They survive that, and then the mood in Europe, not so much in the United States, but certainly in Europe, was a deep disillusionment with the ideals and the institutions of the West, our political institutions, religious institutions. And just think about what is set loose in the midst of the First World War. Not only the influenza virus, which killed more people than did the war itself, but new ideologies, new pandemics, if you will, communism, fascism, eugenics, materialism, these new ideologies that were given kind of a free rein in the aftermath of that First World War. And Tolkien and Lewis have a ringside seat to all of it there in Great Britain.
Mm-hmm. And of course, as you point out in your book, at the very start of the war, there was a sense that this war would be easily won.
Yeah.
And over 16 million lives later, and division after division of young men being just thrown, basically fed to cannons to either defend or take trenches. This presumably had quite an impact on the way people saw authority at the time.
Yeah, it's at a couple of levels, Cherie. They begin to distrust their political authorities, no question about that, because it's the politicians who sent them into this war. And the politicians who keep telling them that it's going to come to a quick end. We just need another 10,000, 15,000, 50,000 men, and we'll turn the tide. But of course, it never happens. They rush the stalemate. So there's that level of kind of disillusionment with authorities. But there's also a disillusionment with even the individual, because the individual himself, the individual soldier, is caught up like cannon fodder. And the idea of individual heroism or virtue, or that your life could make a difference, that is obliterated for many, many young men and women after the war.
You know, you think about some of Tolkien and C.S. Lewis's literary contemporaries, you know, whether it's, or perhaps a little bit earlier, F. Scott Fitzgerald or Ernest Hemingway or Eric Murray Remarque. And there's such a sense of disillusionment. I mean, it was called a lost generation. But Lewis and Tolkien seem to have retained very strongly the ideal of heroism. What enabled them to respond differently to the same war?
It's a terrific question. I'm still kind of grasping it. I'm still trying to plunge the depths of that. You have a T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland, you know, kind of response to the war. And yet Tolkien and Lewis go on to write these epic, mythic tales of heroism and a fight between good and evil. How did they do that? Well, we have to say initially, at a rock bottom level, their Christian faith gave them a kind of realism about human suffering and the problem of evil. They didn't get sucked into the utopian ideologies on the one hand, but neither could they become cynics about the grace of God and the dignity of man. They will not become cynics about those things. And I think they even will draw on some of their war experiences where they did see genuine acts of compassion, forgiveness, heroism that they couldn't shake, they couldn't forget, and I think entered into their great epic works.
Mm-hmm. Both Lewis and Tolkien seem to grapple a lot with ideas of power. You know, you have the ring itself and Lord of the Rings as being one of the causes of great evil. And of course, C.S. Lewis wrote The Inner Ring, an essay you well know. How did the war shape their view of power?
Yeah, I think it's probably, certainly the First World War, but it's probably as much the Second World War as well. And the rise of these totalitarian powers, Cherie, that is really driving home to them the danger of the will to power. Because think about it, they start writing their epic works when the Nazis and the communists are on the march in the late 1930s. Tolkien starts writing The Lord of the Rings in 1937. Hitler has already torn up the Versailles Treaty. He's already absorbed Austria. And so he's on the march. The communists are on the march. Lewis will write the Space Trilogy, 1938. He'll start that kind of work. So the temptation to power and the use and abuse of science in the service of power becomes a huge theme in their works. And it's just no coincidence. They are deliberately pushing back, I think, in a way that some biographers have not maybe fully appreciated. They are pushing back in their writings against the totalitarian impulse and trying to defend the role of the individual and the choices that individuals have to make to push back against the will to power, right?
So we're going to talk about the friendship between Lewis and Tolkien in just a minute or two, but both Lewis and Tolkien as young men went through experiences where, in Tolkien's case, almost all of his close friends were killed at the front. And with Lewis, many of his closest friends were killed at the front, where you know, the friendships they really invested in, the individuals they really identified with, were suddenly gone. How does that kind of loss at a young age, you know, and of course, both of them talk about how the loss of a friend is really the loss of a civilization. How does that kind of loss at such a young age form their view of friendship, but also shape their literary imagination?
Those are wonderful questions, and I'm still exploring it. We'll certainly explore it in the film series that we're working on. Mm-hmm. You know, Tolkien had his own band of brothers going into the First World War. 3 other men, the 4 of them, met in boarding school, and then they were off to Oxford, and then they were off to war together. And Two of those close friends, Paris, another survived. Christopher Wiseman survived. Tolkien would name one of his sons after Christopher Wiseman. And the sense of so much has been robbed from them. That shared sense of camaraderie, the deep friendship, their shared moral vision, which they really had. You know, they're young men, they want to change the world at 17, 18, 19. And then half of them are just gone. Lewis, it was the same. He lost most of his closest friends in the war. I think one of the things it gave them was, of course, they want to recapture that deep sense of camaraderie and sense of mission and purpose, I think, after the war. And we can get into it more in other questions, but I think that's one of the reasons they were so determined to form their group of friends known as the Inklings at Oxford. And they were so devoted to that circle of friends, Lewis and Tolkien at the core of it, but then other men would join in over the years. I think that war experience had a huge role to play in their commitment to friendship throughout their lifetime. Yeah.
So how did Lewis and Tolkien become friends?
You know, it didn't start out well, actually. They met at a faculty meeting. And, you know, for a faculty guy like me, faculty meetings can be a real chore. This was probably one of the most important faculty meetings in the history of Western civilization. You know, in 1926 is when they met at Oxford for the first time. And they didn't quite like each other. They were on different sides of a debate about curriculum reform. But then they began to spend some time together. Tolkien pulled Lewis into a kind of a reading group. They were reading Icelandic sagas in their original languages. You know, only Oxford Dons would do that, right? But Lewis loved it. And they loved the kind of northern heroic spirit that was embodied in these works. And that's what they began to figure out that they loved together. They loved mythology. They loved stories of great heroism and sacrifice. And of course, the real problem of evil, the tragedy of the human condition, but men and women fighting back against it. They loved those stories. And that really drew them together.
You've mentioned a couple of times the Inklings. And of course, this is a group that has had an incredible impact on the moral, spiritual, literary imagination of the world, you know, the world over. Yeah. Tell us a bit about the Inklings. So who were they? Yeah. What did they actually do when they got
You know, it's so amazing. They never imagined it would become the kind of influential group that it did. Lewis wrote to a guy that he was inviting to join the Inklings, I think Owen Barfield. He says there were two requirements. You have a tendency to write, and you are a Christian. Those were the two qualifications. You write, and you're a believer in the Christian faith. There were probably, scholars identify maybe something like 19 different people would have passed through on a semi-regular basis through the years, and they met for the better part of 20 years. Every Thursday evening in Lewis's rooms, his academic rooms at Magdalen College, but then also at the Eagle and Child pub on Tuesday mornings. I've been to both those places, of course. And what they did was they shared the works, the literary works that they were all laboring over. They would read aloud portions of it. Tolkien read most of the Lord of the Rings out loud to the Inklings. Lewis would read aloud many of his works to the Inklings and receive this sort of serious, fierce, but also loving criticism and sharpening each other in the context of that week after week after week. It's really an amazing group of men. If I could mention maybe just one of those other men that's not well known quickly here, Cherie. One of them was Owen Barfield. Barfield was one of the original Inklings. He knew Lewis from his early Oxford days as a student. They were friends for 40 some odd years. Barfield was a writer in his own right. He was working at the Oxford English Dictionary the Oxford Literary Review, when Lewis sent in a manuscript, one of his own manuscripts. Here's Owen Barfield reading a work from Lewis, and he's loving it. And he starts writing a letter to Lewis to tell him how much he loves it. Well, Lewis has picked up at the same time a book from Barfield, and he loves that. And he's writing a letter to Barfield and says, you've got to come join the Inkling. So it's things like that just a kind of a natural organic kind of coming together of these men.
So even before the Inklings and even before Lewis's conversion to Christianity, he and Tolkien were friends. I guess having developed from this faculty meeting.
Yeah.
You describe in your book an important conversation that took place September 19th of 1931 that lasted into the wee hours of the night. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that and how that conversation between friends changed the world.
It really did. I think it's one of the most important conversations probably in the history of the world. It's not putting it too strongly. One of the most important conversations. You got to remember that Lewis he grew up at a time when it was seen by the academic elites that Christianity was a myth, like all the other myths out there, the ancient pagan myths. There's no truth value to it. And he very much believes that as a young man, a young atheist. And then he meets J.R.R. Tolkien, who was a believing, serious Catholic. And Tolkien thinks about myths in a different way. The conversation they have on Addison's path, Addison's walk, which I've been on over there, till 3 o'clock in the morning, they're talking with another man, Hugo Dyson, the three of them, particularly Lewis and Tolkien. They're talking about myth, and they're arguing about myth. And could Christianity be anything more than just an old pagan myth? And what Tolkien helps Lewis to understand is that Christianity is in some ways like these other ancient myths in that there's the idea of the God who comes to earth on a great mission, a mission of redemption, to give his life for his people. Lewis loved that kind of idea when he saw it in pagan literature, but not in Christianity. And what Tolkien helps him to see is Christianity is the myth that became fact. It's the true myth. It's the myth from which all the other myths are derived. They're hints and intimations of the great myth, the Christian myth that became fact. And that conversation, Lewis says, it just cleared away these prejudices and thinking. It opened the door to his mind. And he says later that, as he wrote to one of his friends, had a conversation with Tolkien last night. It was the immediate cause of his conversion to Christianity. It was decisive for him. And within days, he becomes a committed Christian.
You know, it's fascinating because they're talking about myth at the very time when around the world, myths are dying. Disillusionment reigns.
Yep.
Why do you think myth became a portal to faith for Lewis at the very time that myths seem to be closing in the minds of other people's imaginations?
That's a fabulous question, Cherie. When your questions, I never get yes, no questions. I always get these amazing questions that I've hardly thought about. And it's a question probably more for a professor of literature, but I'll take a stab at it.
Oh, I'm sure you're up to it, Joe.
Well, your audience is going to be more up to it than me, but I'll take a stab at it. We think of myths as just falsehoods. Even today, we think, well, it's a myth. There's nothing to that. But a myth in a culture really represents, the best myths represent deep truths about the human condition, about our nobility, but also about our depravity, our sin, our weaknesses, the combination, the tragedy of the human condition of what these myths represent. So qualities like heroism and sacrifice for a noble cause, those virtues, they're embedded in the best myths. They have this universal appeal. And I think Tolkien and Lewis they want to use that genre because they want to reinvent the ancient myths for the modern mind, to hold on to these great truths of the faith. That's their strategy. And here we are with the results of that strategy, right?
Yeah. And one of the things I'd love to get your thoughts on is the friendship between Lewis and Tolkien and other members of the Inklings. It was clearly so pivotal to their life. It had such an influence in their life, their thought, their imagination, their work. And one of the things that's interesting in both Lewis and Tolkien's work, friendship and courage is often linked. And there's often a theme of a character, whether it's a child or a hobbit, who is called to great difficulty and does not initially have the resources they need to meet that difficulty, but essentially gets called into the quest largely from the formation of both character and courage through friendship. And I wanted to just get your thoughts on how Lewis and Tolkien, how did they regard the relationship between friendship and courage?
Wow, fabulous question. I think they drew from different sources, Cherie. I think that at some level they did draw from those ancient great stories that they loved where they would see friendship. King Arthur, the Knights of the Round Table, those kinds of stories. But then also I think their war experience as well shapes them. So what are they doing in their works? Think about Lucy, the character of Lucy in the Chronicles of Narnia, who has that moment when Aslan asks her to do something that she doesn't want to do. And she's afraid of where it's going to lead. And she tells herself, but I just must do it. I just must obey. And that little act of obedience, then we're told all Narnia will be made free. the consequences of a little child's decision. And that is so deliberate on the part of these guys, that she, in communion with her siblings and these others, they're involved in this great task and quest. And of course, the Lord of the Ring is all about the fellowship of the ring, right? The fellowship of the ring. And I think Tolkien saw that in the trenches in the First World War, because he says specifically that his Sam Gamgee, and this is pretty much an exact quote, my Sam Gamgee is indeed based on the privates that I knew in the 1914 war and regarded as so far superior to myself. So he made those hobbits small of stature, but put them in community to remind the reader about this dynamic between friendship, individuals who don't seem to matter but do, but they have to have the help of their comrades and their companions along the way. They can't do it by themselves. Frodo doesn't succeed on his own, does he? At the end of the day, he can't. He needs Sam.
You know, in addition to friendship being a spur to courage, both Lewis and Tolkien, but perhaps Lewis in particular, also seems to regard story in the same way. You know, and here I'm thinking about Eustace Scrubb, and we know right from the beginning that Eustace is an objectionable guy, not only from his name, but Lewis also goes on to tell him that Scrubb likes to read about imports, exports, and plumbing drains, but he's never read about dragons. And so we know right away there's something off with Eustace. Eustace then confronts a dragon. He has no idea what to do. And worse, he eventually becomes one himself. And we're at a time now where some of us actually have a little bit more time to read than we may normally have. So I wanted to ask your thoughts on what Lewis in particular thought about the way that story, especially worthy story, forms our character and our courage.
Yeah, our character, our courage, our moral imagination. And both of them are drawn to it. Tolkien and Lewis, of course, as well. I'll say quickly on dragons, because you maybe think of dragons. I went to the Bodleian Library here in November, there in Oxford, for part of the film trip, and found a manuscript that is not widely known, a talk that Tolkien gave on dragons and what they represent in mythology and in the world. They represent evil. And it's the idea of people coming together to battle this dragon. So for Lewis, you know, what's driving him in so much of his writing about the heroic quest and what's important? Wow, I mean, think about heroism and think about how important he regards heroism in a time when it has been discarded in the 1930s and 40s. People have simply let go of the idea that individuals can really combat evil. They're caught up in these epic forces beyond them, beyond their capacity to respond. But it's so crucial for them to, I think, to hold on to that. So how does storytelling help us to do that? One of the huge authors that was immensely important to Lewis was George MacDonald. And what MacDonald did in books like Fantastes that Lewis encountered as a young man when he's still an atheist, Lewis says that story, it awakened his moral imagination. It taught him to learn to love goodness, But it happened through storytelling. It didn't happen through philosophical argument for Lewis. He says very explicitly, it didn't necessarily challenge his conscience or his kind of rational reasoning processes. It got to his heart and helped him to learn goodness. And it's part of his conversion story. So there's something about a narrative that pulls us in and it kind of takes us unawares and it takes down our defenses. And that's something that Lewis went back to again and again, the power of a well-told story to sneak past our prejudices, right? And introduce us to beauty and to truth.
You know, one of the lovely things about the Inklings is that combine friendship and story. And I think probably a lot of our listeners are thinking, you know, that sounds wonderful. I mean, maybe not the ancient Icelandic languages, but the rest of it sounds really wonderful.
Not my cup of tea either, yeah.
How does one form Inklings in one's own life?
Yeah, I'll share a little bit from these guys to maybe give us some hints about that. They're deliberate about it, and they're faithful. So not only are they meeting every Thursday night, I mean, through the Second World War, they continue to meet with all the demands on their time. and they're very committed to their own family relationships. They haven't let go of those. They're very grounded in their own family relationships. But this is something different outside of the family that they feel like they need. They can't really do without. So, and they took long walks, sometimes multiple days at a time, in the English countryside. And they'd hang out at these inns on their walking tours. Tolkien would complain that Lewis would walk with the cadence of a drill sergeant. He was always on the move. If I could read a couple of lines, Cherie, if I could, from Lewis's wonderful book, The Four Loves, from his chapter on friendship. And I think you know these lines. I think we've talked about them before, Cherie. He's talking about friendship, and he's obviously hearkening back to the friendships that he's established over the years with Tolkien, with Barfield, with these others. And here's how he describes what it can look like. He says, when the whole group is together, each bringing out all that is best, wisest, or funniest in all the others, those are the golden sessions. When 4 or 5 of us, after a hard day's walking, have come to our inn, and when our slippers are on, our feet spread out towards the blaze, and our drinks at our elbows, when the whole world and something beyond the world opens itself to our minds as we talk, and an affection mellowed by the years enfolds us. Life, natural life, he says, has no better gift to give. Who could have deserved it? Wow. There's no better gift than that, but you have to work at it. You have to be committed to it, and it has to be about something important, right? Lewis said they came to talk about literature. That was their goal. But then he says in a letter, but always we talked about something better. Something better. We don't always know what the better was, but boy, to have been a fly in that room, right?
Absolutely. Well, Joe, as you might imagine, the questions are piling up. We have a couple of dozen questions from our listeners wanting to ask you, but we're going to start with a question from our co-host in this venture, Faith and Law. And so Lauren Noyes asked you to name one aspect of the achievements of Tolkien and Lewis that is not widely known or appreciated.
Yeah, Lauren, thank you for that question. And I'm going to unpack a little bit what I just suggested with Cherie. I think these guys in their writings, if you think about The Lord of the Rings, The Chronicles of Narnia, the Space Trilogy, The Abolition of Man, The Hobbit, these guys are, I think, very deliberately pushing back a mindset, pushing back against a mindset in the 1930s especially, that is raging itself against human dignity, against things that are transcendent. It's a very materialistic age and a very totalitarian age. And I think in their works, it is a deliberate, a very conscious, very textured approach to saying, no, that's not the truth about the human condition. The will to power, the state, the individual is subsumed into the state. I mean, think about the heroic narratives in their story. Individuals working in community, they really matter. Whether it's a mouse named Reepicheep, or little children in a wardrobe, or a little hobbit, they matter supremely. And that is simply not what's now dominating the political and cultural landscape of Europe in the 1930s. I think they are deliberately pushing back. And I'm not sure that fact has been appreciated enough by their fans, but we're going to try to rectify that with our film series. So stay tuned for that.
So Cheryl Moore asked, what biographies of Lewis and Tolkien would you recommend?
Oh, great. I've got a couple here right by my elbow here. I will recommend Alistair McGrath, of course, on C.S. Lewis, A Life. Also, rather recently, The Fellowship, The Literary Lives of the Inklings, very good. The Gift of Friendship, Tolkien and Lewis, by Colin Duriez. And I can't forget also Diana Glyer, The Company They Keep, C.S. Lewis, Tolkien as writers in community. We've interviewed all of these people, most all of them, for the film series. I have benefited immensely from that scholarship. You know, I think it was Isaac Newton who said, we're all midgets standing on the shoulders of giants. You know, Isaac Newton said that. Well, Loconte can say it too. You know, we're midgets on the shoulders of giants. So the giants have come before me and done some amazing work. And we're just trying to kind of put them in their historical context, the friendship in its real cultural historical context. Terrific question. Those are all great biographies. Yeah.
Great. So a question from Michael Lundy, who asked, how instrumental were Tolkien's and Lewis's visions of hell in their pursuit of a heavenly one?
Wow. You've got one smart crowd out there. Questions that historians never think to ask are now being asked. So the role of hell in their understanding of heaven. Let me just say something about hell before I forget, which may, I think, connect to the question. Let me get this thought out on hell. Loconte on hell right now. Lewis conceived of the screw tape letters. So we think of, there's a meditation on the devil and on hell, right? He conceives of that book, ladies and gentlemen, when he's sitting in church, in his church in Oxford in 1939. It's within a few days, I think, after, no, excuse me, it's 1940. Britain is at war with Germany. And he's just heard a speech from Adolf Hitler for the first time on the BBC, simultaneously translated into English. He heard that speech, I think, on a Friday night. Sunday in church, while the sermon is going on, he's thinking about the devil. He says later on, it was then that he conceived of the idea of the screw tape letters, sitting in that church. So he's meditating on the problem of evil, and again, his cultural historical context, this great evil that is now enveloping Europe. Britain is fighting for its life. The Battle of Britain is literally on in 1940. So the relation between that and heaven, that's a great theological, literary question. You know, Lewis and Tolkien both, it seems to me in their writings, they want to emphasize individual choice, and that heaven is this opportunity and this invitation that God offers to every person. Lewis says someplace that no man who seriously, continuously desires joy will ever miss it. And the desire for joy is the desire for heaven. And so what's the counterpoint? If people do not seek joy and seek the good, if they don't respond to those longings that God has given them in their own hearts, then there's no place else to go. The only place outside of heaven and joy is a hell, is an abandonment. Mm-hmm. So it is absolutely part of their thinking, their whole conceptual approach to literature, and their lives, their literary lives, is you have to be allowed a choice to choose heaven or to choose the alternative, abandonment by God and hell. They're in that sense, they're inseparable because of the way God has made us and made the universe a loving relationship based on choice.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So our next question comes from Carl Lynch. And one thing I should have mentioned to our viewers earlier is that in addition to asking a question, you can like a question. And the more questions are liked, the more likely we are to ask them. So this question comes from Carl Lynch, who asks, we know that Churchill early recognized the evil of Hitler. I have never seen any, or at least not many, comments of C.S. Lewis or J.R.R. Tolkien on Hitler and Nazism. And he wants to know if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been looking over their letters a little bit more recently in the 1930s and 40s. I just read the other night, actually. Tolkien is commenting on Hitler's Germany. And he says he's angry at different levels at this vile, brutish figure in Germany, not only because of his anti-Semitism, because there's not an anti-Semitic bone in Tolkien's body or in Lewis's body. Not only the anti-Semitism, but from Tolkien's perspective, Hitler is doing such damage to what he loved about the German people, the heroic Germanic spirit. And Hitler has taken it and perverted it and blackened it, he fears. What he thought of as a northern German heroic spirit. And now Hitler is just giving such a dismal account of all that for the German people. And this is, I think it's a letter he writes to his publisher, Tolkien does at the time. It's around 1939 and 1940 in the midst of the war. And Lewis will have his own comments about Hitler and communism and fascism both. So it's a terrific question. I'm going to explore it more. Thank you for that prompt.
So this question comes from Catherine S. Will you please comment on why Tolkien was so opposed to the idea of the Lord of the Rings being an allegory, especially World War II, when his dear friend Lewis seemed to embrace his own in Chronicles of Narnia as a clear allegory? Yeah. Was this variation in approach due to differences in their personalities or how they viewed their own writing?
That's an excellent question. I can only take a stab at. And many in your audience are going to have a better answer than this, but here we go. I think some of it was their experience of faith, their faith commitments. Lewis came to faith, of course, as an atheist, a pretty strenuous atheist. Mm-hmm. And his Christian conversion is over a course of time, it's a dramatic event in his life. Tolkien becomes a Catholic early in life, and it's with him, and it grows and deepens. And Lewis has, I think, the heart and the sort of soul of the evangelist. In a more explicit way, he wants to use his writing to introduce people to the Christian faith in a more kind of direct way. And I don't think Tolkien approached his Catholic faith and its relationship to his writing in quite the same way, even though he believed that the Lord of the Rings, and he writes about this in some of his letters, Tolkien does, the Lord of the Rings, he says, is a deeply Catholic work, deeply Catholic. But for Tolkien, it's much more subtle. It's clearly a moral universe with a transcendent moral code and a fight between good and evil, but it's these deep transcendent ideas are kind of embedded in the narrative. And that's just part of, I think, his own theological approach, as much as perhaps anything else, literary taste. I could be wrong, and I'm happy to be corrected, but I think it explains some of it.
That's great. So a question from Peter Petit, who writes, you just spoke about Lewis and Tolkien's friendship not beginning well. Will you speak about it not finishing well? I think it is important to round out the picture.
Well, that's an excellent question. It was strong for many years, right through the 1940s. It went through a rough patch, I would say, in the 1950s for different reasons. Some of it may have been the introduction of Joy Davidman into his life, the marriage to Joy. I don't think Tolkien liked her very much, although that's, I guess, debatable a bit. He was kind of taken by surprise by the presence of her, the arrival of Joy, this whirlwind New Yorker. That takes a lot of people by surprise. That's off-putting for a lot of people. As a native New Yorker, I can say that. That's some of it. Also, Lewis, I think, had a greater capacity for friendship with different people than Tolkien did. And there may have been a sense of being hurt, that Tolkien felt like Lewis was expanding the circle of the Inklings to other people. And I think Tolkien may have felt a little wounded. And that may be the fact that Tolkien may have just emotionally needed more of that relationship with Lewis, because he was an orphan at a young age, as a young man, and that sense of vulnerability may have been more heightened with Tolkien. I'm not sure. But I want to say, I think it did end well, because near the end, they are exchanging letters to each other. And when C.S. Lewis dies in 1963, Tolkien writes in a letter, I think, to his son, Christopher, he says, this feels like an axe blow near the roots. An axe blow near the roots. Well, that's a friendship that's still intact, as far as I can tell. Lewis certainly felt the affection to Tolkien. I think Tolkien came back around at the end.
That's right. So Noel asked, what is Professor Loconte's opinion on the latest Tolkien movies, the Hobbit trilogy, as well as about other movie adaptations of Lewis and Tolkien's work?
Well, I'm not a film critic, so my opinion is no better than anybody else's and probably worse than anybody else's. Having recently reread The Hobbit, I can only say it doesn't seem to me there were 3 movies in that particular book. And I think the Tolkien estate probably felt the same way, from what I understand. It just seemed to go in directions that Tolkien never really intended. And it just became too much battle scene oriented. Some people make the same criticism of The Lord of the Rings, though I think they're much finer films, more faithful, I think, probably to the original. So I think it just lost kind of some of the magic and the wonder. I mean, the Hobbit is not nearly the sort of heavy story that the Lord of the Rings becomes, right? It's really aimed at children, but teaching them some important moral truths and lessons, battling a dragon. The Lord of the Rings is a heavier tale at the end of the day, for good reason. So I wasn't pleased with the film adaptations. Look, anything that draws people's attention to the writings of Tolkien, I'm generally speaking going to be for.
That's great. So David Wills asked, what's the most underrated or underappreciated work written by a member of the Inklings?
Oh, wow. Any member of the Inklings, eh?
Any member of the Inklings.
Wow. That is a fabulous question. Underappreciated. I'm most familiar with the work of Lewis and Tolkien, so I'm going to confine myself to these guys. I actually think, and Cherie, you'll probably appreciate this, I've been hosting in my home this little Lewis and Linguini group, as you mentioned, this little monthly discussion group about the essays of C.S. Lewis. Mm-hmm. And I think that many of his essays are simply not known to a wider audience. That's what I've discovered in the 15 plus years I've been doing my little Lewis and Linguini group over here. And for the first time, young people especially are being introduced to these wonderful essays that speak into the contemporary moment. And you mentioned his essay, The Inner Ring, is a beautiful example of that. In some ways, a neglected essay, but it's so relevant, especially to our town here, DC, Washington, DC, Sheree, the swamp. The inner ring, the inner circle, the desire to be in the know, and then to exclude people, put them on the out, the power of that, and how that tempts an individual and can lead a young man or a young woman into deep darkness, that desire to be in the inner ring. I mean, it's a wonderful essay written, 70 years ago, but it speaks to the moment. So I put that near the top of the list of underappreciated writings.
That's great. Peggy Parr asked from Lexington, Kentucky, is it correct that Tolkien didn't like Lewis's wife, Joy, and why? So this harkens back to a question or a topic you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, this probably goes back to Tolkien's, and by his own description, he didn't have the same capacity for friendship. He was just more guarded that way, I think. And the introduction of Joy just seemed to take Lewis away from things that Tolkien thought maybe were a little bit more important. She just seemed too erratic, too out there. But I don't want to go further than that. I haven't explored that with care. So I don't want to be uncharitable in any way, because obviously Joy meant the world to Lewis. And his reflection on her death is just a remarkable, a grief observed. His reflection on her death and what she meant to him is just one of the most moving reflections on grief you'll ever read. So I want to maybe leave it at that.
Mm-hmm. This is a great question from Cameron Zeller, who asks, what older myths or stories should we read alongside the works of Tolkien and Lewis?
Wow, older myths. The ones I've been reading, the ones I've been trying to get my hands on, actually, when you say older, I've been trying to read some of the stuff that influenced Tolkien and Lewis. So certainly I put some George MacDonald on the list, but another book I put on the list right here on my little coffee table. You maybe can't quite see it, but it's a long title. The Story of the Glittering Plain, which has also been called The Land of Living Men, or The Acre of the Undying Written by William Morris. William Morris was this
quite
mythic,
the title.
Yeah, quite the title. He couldn't decide what to call it, I guess. But William Morris had a real influence on Lewis's generation, on Lewis and Tolkien especially, this romantic, mythic story. And you start reading some lines and you think, yeah, that sounds like something Lewis would have loved to have read for the first time. The way it stirs the heart with its nobility, or the idea of sacrifice. You see it in William Morris. So I might put William Morris, The Story of the Glittering Plain. You'll probably have to get it on eBay. It's a little tough to get, but it's worth. I'm just about halfway through it. Lovely book. Yeah.
Related to that, in your mind, who were the greatest literary influences on both Tolkien and Lewis?
For Tolkien, it's probably, if I had to name a single kind of a mythic writer, it would be the story of Beowulf. Beowulf, the Scandinavian hero, back from the 6th century, goes back that far. When Tolkien discovered Beowulf, he just became absorbed in the story, this epic quest, really against impossible odds at the end of the day, and then ultimately Beowulf dying in the final battle. He not only absorbed it, but he taught a course on Beowulf. He translated Beowulf. He delivered a really important lecture on Beowulf in the 1930s, which transformed the academic approach to Beowulf. So that was really a hugely important part of his intellectual formation, his academic career, that concept. For Lewis, I'd have to say George MacDonald. And he encountered MacDonald when he was an atheist. It's about 1916. He knows he's going off to war, the First World War, but he's not there yet. He's on a train platform, and he picks up the book in a little bookstall. And he says when he read Fantastes, George MacDonald's book Fantastes, when he read it, he says, after a few hours, I knew I had crossed a great frontier. Lewis will be recommending George MacDonald's Fantastes up until, I think, the week before he died, in letters that he's writing to other people. He recommended the book again and again and again. In the 1920s, when he's still an atheist, he says to one of his friends in a letter, I just finished reading MacDonald's Fantastes again over my tea. I have read it many times. It's become a kind of devotional work for me. So, hugely important book in his life.
Yeah, that's great. So this is an interesting question from John Morris, who asked, if we could imagine Lewis and Tolkien living in the 21st century, what might their discussion focus on as they FaceTimed on Friday, April 24th, 2020?
You know, that question, John, I have to say, at the risk of making another shameless plug, we want to have like episode 5 of the film series explore kind of that question. What would Tolkien and Lewis have to say to us today, the issues, and how would they, react to it? I think on the one hand, they probably would be troubled by the lack of the sort of the foundation, the literary and intellectual foundation that they got and they took for granted in their Oxford days. They were steeped in the classics, the canon of Western civilization. They knew it, those great texts, the Christian, Greek, Roman foundation for our civilization. They knew those great works, and that helped to really inform their literary imagination, no question. So I think they'd be wondering why we've abandoned that almost entirely in our society, because they knew how important that was to carrying on the legacy, because the threats to your civilization are going to continue to come, and you have to know what's worth defending. So I think that would be one thing. I couldn't necessarily name the most important issue that they would be concerned about, but just think more kind of broadly about, we have our own assaults on human dignity today, and what it means to be human. And I think they would be coming back to that question, particularly with the spiritual dimension in mind, that we're not just matter. And yes, in the midst of this pandemic crisis, we want to save lives, but we also want to remember that there actually are even more important things than even our physical life and preserving our physical life. There are things even more important than preserving our physical lives. There are these other transcendent values. However we go about that, we've got to keep that in mind. I think they might be speaking into that kind of moment, what we value, the material, the spiritual, the eternal.
Mm-hmm. So a question from Shayna Casby, who asked, I tend to keep my professional relationships and friendships separate. Do you think there is an intentional reason for that today? We're trained to compartmentalize. I would love to have friendships that had such deep purpose.
That's fabulous. That's a fabulous observation. You know, one of the things, I hope this connects to the question. One of the things that has struck me about these men as I've studied their lives, which again is not widely appreciated, they're doing these great creative works in community with each other because they have this shared moral vision. They realize things aren't going the way they should be going in their culture. And the works that we love, that we know of, The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Chronicles of Narnia, the Space Trilogy, you got to remember what those two men were paid to do, their professional work. They were paid as Oxford instructors to hold seminars with students, graduate or undergraduate seminars, at 3 or 4 or 5 people in a room. And we actually interviewed one of C.S. Lewis's students, a lovely woman in her 90s who was tutored by C.S. Lewis. They were paid to do that. They were paid to deliver lectures. They're paid to write academic papers to their peers. The one thing they weren't paid to do was to write The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit or The Chronicles of Narnia. But they had this passion for this other aspect of their lives, their personalities, their gifts. Their gifts weren't just in one place. I think they enjoyed their scholarship and their work with students, but they had these other gifts too, the gifts of imagination that Oxford didn't really appreciate at the time. They weren't praised by their peers for these works. These were seen as strange hobbies. Tolkien described his love of languages and his Hobbit stuff as a mad hobby. And Lewis helped persuade him it wasn't just a mad hobby. He helped persuade Tolkien that there was something in it. So I'm not sure how to answer the question, except to say, I've been so deeply encouraged that these men pursued their mad hobbies, their other sense of calling, a broader sense of calling, their gifts outside of their paid work, their paid profession, and look at the results again.
Yeah, that's great. So Mimi asked, how did C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien connect to Bonhoeffer?
How did they connect to Bonhoeffer? I have not yet found, and I'm not saying it's not there, I have not yet found a discussion in their writings and their letters to Bonhoeffer specifically. It's a good thing for me to start searching out. They're obviously aware of everything that's going on in Nazi Germany, more so than the Americans are. You got to remember, because, right across the English Channel, you're not far to Berlin. When the Blitz starts, when the bombing of London starts, they are really uncertain if English civilization is going to survive. So they're paying close attention to what's happening over there. I don't know that they had a particular kind of thought or insight into what Bonhoeffer was, his role over there. I just don't know the answer. It's a good question to ask as we move forward with other research projects. So thanks for the question.
You bet. So Becky Imperial asked, how can reading the works of Lewis and Tolkien help us presently in the area of suffering? How can we teach our kids with these works to move through suffering and towards courage?
Yeah, thank you, Becky, for that question. That is such a rich question. And again, I can only just take a stab at it. What I so appreciate about these men, and good biographies should do this for us. You understand that they went through suffering, they somehow came out stronger men. They didn't allow it to overwhelm them. And I love part of our topic today, the title. I mean, this resilience and imagination. There is a deep relationship between the two. Part of the way that these men processed their suffering and dealt with it and faced it was through the use of their imaginative, creative gifts. They did not allow themselves to take on the role of the victim, and it would have been very easy to do as war veterans who didn't have much to come back to after the First World War. No promises, no guarantees, no Social Security. They're fending for themselves in a war that their own country came to kind of resent, almost in a way that we came to resent the Vietnam War. Maybe not quite that bad for the English, but there was a growing resentment about the whole enterprise. So easy for them to play the victim. They're not going to do it. I think, again, without question, think about the group of the Inklings. A lot of the members of the Inklings were former war veterans themselves. They'd also survived the trenches. And we don't know this. I haven't found it yet. They must have talked about the war in those sessions together. It had to come up, right? That kind of, yes, you too, kind of discussions, you know? And that in itself, that knowing, that understanding is a help, is a way to kind of in fellowship together. But of course, at the end of the day, their Christian faith, that realism about suffering, that it is part of the tragedy of the human condition, and yet there's hope. There is a rational, biblical basis for hope, not a kind of false utopian optimism, but a real hope grounded in something real, the Christian story. And they came back to that again and again and again, the reality of the Christian story as the great anchor for them, I think, through their darkest days, not only the First World War, but right through the Second World War as well.
The witching hour is almost here, so we're going to take just two more questions. Okay. And have a great question from our mutual friend, Patrick Wilson, who writes, all the Inklings also like poetry, not just prose or stories.
Yeah.
What role does this kind of art, and perhaps music too, play in their arguments on the Christian lives?
What roles do play in their lives, in their Christian lives, Cherie? Mm-hmm. You know, I took a shot at poetry when I was an undergraduate, failed miserably at it. So it's always been another one of those knowledge gaps and weaknesses in my life. We add to the weaknesses. But you're right, they did think of themselves. Lewis thought he was going to be a poet initially. And then he found out, this is another good little lesson for us. He just found out the reviewers of his poetry weren't necessarily encouraging him in that direction. And he had to kind of rethink his life aspiration. And yet, there is a sort of poetic quality to their works, isn't there? To both of their works. They have the poet's ear for the rhythm, the magic that can come with poetry, and the way it opens up the imagination, and the beauty that great poetry can communicate. It just opens up our senses in ways that ordinary prose doesn't do. Tolkien especially, I mean, how many times are the hobbits breaking out into song, into some kind of poetic song as they're on their great trek? So it plays a really important role, it seems to me, in their literature. It's another genre of writing that they obviously thought was essential. It was part of how they were going to communicate the great truths of the faith and the beauty and the goodness of the faith that they were trying to reintroduce to their generation. Great question.
So we have lots of questions remaining and very little time. So I will somewhat awkwardly try to combine two unlike questions and just throw them at you for quick responses. One comes from Mr. Shahid, who writes that as a Muslim, I've always been drawn to both Tolkien and C.S. Lewis's writings and mythologies. Can you comment on any Eastern influences that may have made an impression on them? And then there's another question on an unrelated topic from an anonymous attendee who asks that ISI recently shared an article about how we shouldn't just be content with Lewis and Tolkien when it comes to literature. Are there any contemporary authors who put forward similar themes that you would recommend? So, Eastern
Wow,
influences and contemporary authors.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to try to follow up with our Muslim friend on that question. I don't know the answer to that question, and I'd love to follow up with them and try to explore that maybe together. Other contemporary writers, I do want to just say though, we could do worse than spending many, many months and even years immersed in the writings of Tolkien. It's so rich, and I'm finding that out as I'm working on this film project, as I'm reading them again and again, and then reading what they were influenced by. I think a good place to go to get your short list of the authors who influenced Tolkien and Lewis. Whether it's a Beowulf, whether it's a MacDonald, a William Morris, I think that'd be a pretty good collection of works.
And so, Joe, as we wrap up, I'd love to give you the last word on Tolkien, Lewis, resilience, and imagination.
Yeah, I think maybe the best way to close is a little portion from The Lord of the Rings, because I think it so captures their basis for hope and a source of great resilience for them. It's just a few lines, Cherie, from The Lord of the Rings. It's near the end of the quest with Frodo and Sam. They're in the land of shadow on the way to Mordor, and everything looks hopeless on the way to Mordor now. It looks hopeless. Hope fails and end comes, Frodo tells Sam. We have only a little time to wait now. We are lost in ruin and downfall, and there's no escape. And then Frodo, he's just given up any hope or thought of ultimate success, but not Samwise Gamgee. Sam hasn't given up. There, peeping among the cloud rack above a dark tor, high up in the mountains, Sam saw a white star twinkle for a while, and the beauty of it smote his heart as he looked up out of the forsaken land, and hope returned to him. For like a shaft, clear and cold, the thought pierced him that in the end, the shadow was only a small and passing thing. There was light and high beauty forever beyond its reach. Light and high beauty forever. Maybe that's the prayer for us, Cherie, that we have the heart and the faith and the imagination to see it.
Joe, thank you for joining us. It's always a delight to talk with you.
Thanks so much, Cherie. Great being with you.
And to all of our viewers, thank you for joining us. We appreciate your time, your attention. Have a great weekend and happy reading.